Some pleasures are necessary and some aren't. And some are necessary up to a point, but too much of them or too little isn't necessary. And the same goes for desires and pains. That being so, someone who pursues excessive pleasures or necessary ones excessively by choice, and for the pleasures themselves, not some other consequence of them, that's your lecherous, gluttonous man. He's called kalastos, literally uncontrollable, unstoppable, because by definition, he never feels any regret, so he's incurable. Because if you don't regret, you're incurable. And someone who pursues pleasure too little is the opposite of that, whatever that's called. And the person in the middle is somewhat, or I'm sorry, and the person in the middle is someone moderate. Similarly, with pains, one type of person shirks physical pains not because they can't handle them, but by choice. Others shirk pain against their choice and intent. Of those, some are driven by pleasure and some by the need to escape the pain of their desires. So, those are different from one another. And anyone would agree that if you do something shameful, for example, commit adultery, without even feeling any desire or from only mild desire, that's worse than if you only do it because of a really intense desire. And if you hit someone when you aren't even angry, that's worse than doing it because you're angry. Because if you're the first type, just imagine what you'd be doing if you did feel those emotions. That's why a lecherous man is, in fact, a worse person than someone who lacks self control. Of the two types just described, people who shirk pain by choice and people who pursue excessive pleasure by choice, the first is, more strictly, a form of being soft. The second is the lecherous, gluttonous man. The opposite of someone who has self control is someone who lacks self control. And the opposite of someone soft is someone resilient. Being resilient is about holding out, but self control is about controlling, mastering. And holding out against X is different from mastering X. Rather, in the way that not being defeated by the enemy is different from defeating them. That's why self-control is a more valuable quality than resilience. Someone who falls short here, who can't handle the kinds of pains that most people make an effort against and succeed, that's someone soft or delicate. Being delicate is another way of being soft, by the way. Think of someone who trails his cloak along the ground to avoid the terrible pain and suffering of having to lift it up, or the hypochondriac who impersonates an invalid and thinks he isn't pitiful, even though he behaves like someone who is. The same applies to having or lacking self control. The point is, if someone's overwhelmed by powerful and extreme pleasures or pains, that's understandable. We're forgiving towards that kind of thing if they put up a struggle, like Philoctetes, Philoctetes in Theodectes version, the Theodectes version. When he's been bitten by the snake, or Cercion in Alope by Parsinus, or people who try to hold back their laughter, then crack up explosively. Remember what happened at Xenophantus? Remember remember when that happened to Xenophantus? It's only significant when someone is overwhelmed by or can't withstand. Oh, sorry. It's only significant when someone is overwhelmed by or can't withstand the kind of pleasures or pains that most people can hold out against, assuming it's not because of some natural family trait or gender trait or illness like the softness that runs in the family of the kings of Scythia, or the gap between men and women. We also tend to think of people who love to party and playboys as lecherous. Actually, they're just soft. Partying is a form of relaxing. It's a way of taking a break. Some people go too far with their relaxing. Party lovers are in that group. There are two forms of lacking self control: being impulsive and being weak. In some cases, people deliberate beforehand, but then feeling and emotion makes them fail to stick to what they decided. That's weakness. In other cases, it's because people haven't deliberated, that they're carried away by emotion. In other cases, it's because people haven't deliberated, that they're carried away by emotion. Because, like the way you can stop yourself from being ticklish by tickling yourself first, some people, if they're because, like the way you can stop yourself from being ticklish by tickling yourself first, some people, if they're aware ahead of time, see what's coming and pump themselves up and rouse their reasoning in advance. Then they aren't overwhelmed when the emotion or feeling hits them, whether it's pleasure they're up against or pain. It's mostly quick tempered or hot, passionate people who lose control of the impulsive way. Because of the speed of their temper or the intensity of their feelings, they don't wait around for reason to do its work. They just go with their first impressions. So, a lecherous, gluttonous man, as we said, isn't going to regret his actions. He's chosen to behave that way and is sticking to his choice. But anyone who lacks self control is bound to feel regret. That's why that paradox that we mentioned earlier is, in fact, not correct. It's actually the first type who's incurable. Lack of self control is curable. Excuse me. If it were an illness, then being a wicked person is like dropsy, say, or tuberculosis, but a loss of self control is more like a seizure. One is a constant defect, the other only strikes now and then. And in general, lacking self control is a different kind of thing from being a bad person. For one thing, you can be a bad person without realizing it, but you can't lack self control without realizing it. And if people who do lack self control and the ones who lose their heads are better people than the ones who retain their reason but don't stick to it. The second sort can be overwhelmed by less powerful emotion, and you can't say they act without any forethought like the other sort. Someone who lacks self control is like those people who get drunk quickly. Without drinking, uh, have too many applications going. Oh, I think it's good. So many background programs running. It's taking all the my computer's processing. I think it's fixed now. Well, I hope that wasn't super terrible. Anyways, And in general, lacking self control is a different kind of thing from being a bad person. For one thing, you can be a bad person without realizing it, but you can't lack self control without realizing it. And if people who do lack self control, the ones who lose their heads are better people than the ones who retain their reason but don't stick to it. Second sort can be overwhelmed by less powerful emotion, and you can't say they act without any forethought like the other sort. Someone who lacks self control is like those people who get drunk quickly without drinking a lot of wine, and less wine than it takes most people to get drunk. All right, so it's clear that lacking self control doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you sort of a bad person, arguably, because it's contrary to your choices and aims. But being a bad person is all about your choices and aims. Having said that, they certainly amount to the same thing when it comes to your actions. Remember what Demo- Demodocus said about the Milesians. The Milesians aren't stupid, but they sure act like it. It's the same with people who lack self control. They aren't immoral people, but they'll still do wrong. So here we have two different types of people. Person A, the kind of person who, not because they're convinced they should do so, pursues excessive physical pleasures against their own correct reasoning. Person B, who, because they're the kind of person who pursues them, is actually convinced they should pursue them. So it's the first type who can be fairly easily talked into behaving differently, but the second type can't. Here's why. Being a sorry, here's why. Being a good person or being a nasty person preserves or destroys your ethical starting point. In the context of your actions, your starting point means your purpose, your goal. It plays just the same role as starting assumptions in mathematical problems. So, as in mathematics here too, it isn't reason's job to explain or justify our starting points. No, it's our goodness coming either from our nature or from habituation that makes us have the right belief about that starting point. So, in this context, someone like that with the right starting point is moderate. An lecherous, gluttonous man is the opposite. He has the wrong starting point. But then there's another kind of person, someone who's prone to being unhinged by emotion and going against their own correct reasoning, someone over whom emotion and feeling exert just enough power to stop them actually doing what correct reason is telling them to do, but not enough to turn them into the sort of person who's convinced they actually should be pursuing those kinds of pleasures with abandon. That's the person who lacks self control, a better person than the lecherous man, and not a bad person in the normal sense, because that's the best part of him. That ethical starting point is still there intact. And then finally, there's the person who's the opposite of that. Someone who's able to stick to what reason tells them to do and doesn't get unhinged by emotion. So it should be obvious from all of this that self control is a good quality and lack of self control is a bad one. So it so is it self control if you stick to reason, whatever it says, or to a choice of whatever sort, or only if it's correct? And it is a lar I'm sorry. And is it a lapse of self-control if you fail to stick to any choice of whatever sort or to reason whatever it says? Or not if what it says is false, not if the choice isn't correct? We raised this puzzle earlier. Maybe the answer is that incidentally, yes, you could be sticking to or not sticking to any choice at all. But if we mean per se, then your reason has to be saying something true and your choice has to be correct. Let me explain. Suppose someone chooses or pursues X in order to get Y. That means that per se, they're pursuing and choosing Y and only incidentally choosing and pursuing X. So the standard sense of choosing or pursuing is the per se one. So, yes, in a sense, you can be sticking to or deviating from any opinion whatsoever, but by the normal sense of opinion, it has to be a true one. And there's another class of people who stick to their opinion. We call them pig headed, i.e., people who are hard to persuade and can't be easily made to change their minds. They're certainly a little bit like people with self control, rather, in the same way that an extravagant man is a little bit like a generous one, and a reckless man is a little bit like someone bold, but they're also different and in multiple ways. When someone has self control, it's emotion and desire that can't shift them. They're certainly open to persuasion under the right circumstances, but with pig headed people, it's reason that can't shift them. They're certainly susceptible to desires. As a matter of fact, a lot of them are precisely driven by desires. Pig headed people can be fanatics, ignorant, or yokels. Of those, pig headed people can be fanatics, ignorance, or yokels. I wonder who will win. Of those, fanatics are certainly motivated by both pleasure and pain. They relish the victory when you can't get them to change their mind, and they're distraught when their ideas, their decrees, and dogmas aren't enacted, so to speak. So they're actually more like people who lack self control than people who have it. There are also people who fail to stick to what they've decided, but not because they lack self control, like the Neoptolemus case in Sophocles' Philoctetes, Philoctetes. Jesus. It's true he failed to stick to his decision because of pleasure, but it was an honorable pleasure. Telling the truth was the honorable thing for him to do, and he'd been persuaded to lie by Odysseus. The general point being, just because someone is doing something for pleasure, that doesn't always mean they're lecherous or a bad person or that they lack self control. It has to be a shameful pleasure. There's also the kind of person who enjoys physical pleasures less than one should, and who fails to stick to their reasoning by way of that feature of their character. Someone with self control is between that person and someone who lacks self control. I'll explain. Someone who lacks self control fails to stick to their reasoning because something in them, their desire, is too strong. And this other kind of person because it's too weak. And someone with self control in the middle does stick to what reason says without either of those things shifting him off course. And if having self control is a good thing, then it must be that both of these opposing character traits are bad, just as people assume they are. It's just that because one of them is observed in so few people and so rarely, we tend to think of lacking self control as the only opposite of having self control, like the way we think of the only opposite of being moderate is being lecherous. And since we often use words just on the basis of resemblance, here too we've come to speak of the self control of someone moderate because of the resemblance. After all, someone with self control never does anything contrary to reason on account of physical pleasures, and exactly the same goes for someone moderate. The difference is that the former has bad desires and the latter doesn't. Also, a moderate person is someone who doesn't enjoy things that go against reason, whereas a person with self control is someone who does and would enjoy them. They just aren't carried away by them. Then there's the resemblance between someone who lacks self-control and someone lecherous or gluttonous. They're different kinds of people, of course, but they both pursue physical pleasures. The difference is that one of them is thinking, this is what I should do, and the other, I should not be doing this. Also, it's not possible for the same person to be wise and lack self control. It's not possible for the same person to be wise and lack self control. We showed earlier that being wise implies being a morally good person as well. Also, you're not wise just by knowing what you should do. You also have to be good at actually doing it. And someone who lacks self control isn't good at actually doing it. But there's no reason why you can't be clever and lack self control. That's why some people sometimes seem like they're wise, but also lacking in self control. It's because they're clever, and being clever differs from being wise only in that subtle way that we explained in our earlier discussion, i.e., in terms of their means and reasoning. They're very close. They differ in terms of choice and intent. Also, someone who lacks self control isn't like someone who knows what they should do and is actually thinking about it. They're more like someone who's asleep or drunk. Post-its. That again. Also, someone who lacks self control isn't like someone who knows what they should do and is actually thinking about it. They're more like someone who's asleep or drunk. All, also, though they're certainly acting willfully because, in a sense, they know what they're doing and why they're doing it, they're not wicked people because their underlying choice remains decent. They're sort of semi wicked. And they're not unethical people because they don't plan the harm they do, because by definition, they either A, fail to stick to what they plan, or B, are the hot, impulsive types who act without any planning at all. Someone who lacks self control is like a city that passes all the resolutions that it should and has perfectly good laws, but fails to observe any of them, like that joke in like the like that joke in Anaxagoras. The city has decreed. Yeah, the city where no one gives a hoot about the law. A wicked or evil person, by contrast, is like a city that does observe its laws, but actually has wicked laws. Having or lacking self-control is about going beyond the average state, the average character state. It's about being able to stick to what you've decided more or less than most people are capable of doing. Of the different kinds of lack of self-control, the one that's easier to cure is the kind of lapse of self-control experienced by impulsive people, as opposed to people who do not deliberate but then fail to stick to their decisions. Plus, the people who lack self-control through bad habits are easier to cure than people who have it in their nature. A habit is easier to shift than your nature. After all, that's exactly what makes a habit hard to shift too. The fact that it's quasi nature, like Evanus says. Training yourself, dear friend, takes a very long time to accomplish. But when it comes to an end, it will form a new part of your nature. All right. So we've said what self-control is and lack of self-control, and being resilient and being soft, and how those dispositions relate to one another. We're done.